Okay, everybody, this is a preview of our upcoming chapters. You have chapter 40 and chapter 38. If you'll go ahead and read those, remember we read 37, we skipped 38, read 39. Now, our plan tells us to go ahead and read 40, then read 38. So that brings us to where we are. Here's just an idea of the trail that was taken, the track that Joseph was taken on from the Midianite traders, where his brothers had sold him into slavery for 20 pieces of silver. You know, we're starting right there at Dothan, and he trails on down, forced slavery into this capital called Avarice. Okay, so that is the scene. He ends up in Potiphar's house. And so in chapter 40, this is about 9 years later from the time of Joseph's dreams until the time he's sold into slavery. So around about 1898 to 1887 BC, according to BibleHub.com. So from the time Joseph is sold into slavery to the time of the interpretation of the cupbearer and baker's dreams. So we will be right around 1887 BC. So just as a reminder, we just came out, Joseph has to deal with Potiphar's wife in the chapter 39. And so he's highly faithful. He's a highly effective servant for the house of Potiphar, and who is the captain of Pharaoh's palace guard. And so Joseph shows self-control. We have the request of Potiphar's wife where she attempts to seduce Joseph. And then, of course, in verses 8 through 12 in chapter 39, we have his refusal. He refuses her advances repeatedly, even running from the house on one occasion, leaving his shirt behind. And then it brings us from 13 to 20, where in chapter 39, where he's falsely accused of accused of attempted rape and thrown into prison. So then he shows up, he ends up with the jailer. He is so blessed that he ends up getting favor from the jailer, who places him in charge of the entire prison. So Joseph is going through. And so that brings us to our next chapter that, remember, you try to read it over the weekend, chapter 40. Chapter 38, take your deep dives, use your strategies, and see all what the Lord is showing you in these chapters. And so we have the cupbearer and the baker, visions in the void, Joseph's gift of interpretation. So this chapter serves as a reminder of God's gifts and divine plan, even in adverse circumstances. Joseph uses his God-given gift of dream interpretation to provide comfort and clarity to his fellow inmates. Now, you're going to see that there's one that's not going to have a whole lot of comfort. He might get clarity, but he won't have comfort. Staying faithful despite his situation. Now, you'll see some ingratitude in this chapter because the cupbearer, you're going to see it, there's a little setback there. So Joseph's story teaches us that God's timing is perfect and that deliverance comes in his schedule, not ours. Now, here's a quote from the Cultural Background Study Bible, and it reads, quote, "The chief butler and the chief baker." The word butler is also translated cupbearer and refers to a servant whose task it was to bring the king his drink and also to taste some of it first and ensure that it was not poison. Though these titles may in part be ceremonial, these two men had overall responsibility for what was served to the king. The potential for assassination attempts through the king's food and drink was real and constant. So these officials not only needed to be incorruptible themselves, but also had to be able to hire people above reproach and identify attempts at infiltration by the staff and by enemies of the king. The text is silent concerning their offense, but since both were responsible for meals, it seems logical to speculate that the king may have gotten sick from a meal, close quote. So it brings us to the dreamers. You'll see this in verses 1 through 4. So after the Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker offend him, they're thrown into the same prison where Joseph resides. Joseph is signed to serve them. Then in verses 5 through 8, it's the dreams, and for one person, their troubles. Both men have perplexing dreams on the same night. Upon seeing their distress, Joseph, aware of his gift, offers to interpret their dreams, acknowledging the power is from God. And so that should give you a little hint, these grapes on the vine, about one of the dreams that you will see in this chapter. Verses 9 through 13, you will hear about the cupbearer's dream. And so the cupbearer dreams of a fruitful vine from which he squeezes grape juice into Pharaoh's cup. Joseph interprets this to mean the cupbearer will be restored to his position in 3 days and pleads with him to remember him when he is. Now, remember that one line. Joseph is pleading with the cupbearer to remember him, to let them know that he's been innocently charged and put in prison for something that he did not do. So, check this out. This is the second time. The brothers throw him in a pit because of envy. Now he's in jail because of some, nutty woman who didn't want to be faithful to her husband. All right, so here we go. And then that brings us to the chief baker's dream. That'll be in verses 14 through 19. Encouraged by the favorable interpretation. So, the chief baker, he hears Joseph interpret the cupbearer's dream, and he's like, okay, I'm ready to hear. Go ahead, Joseph, tell me what's going to happen. So he gives him his dream. And so the baker shares his dream of the 3 bread baskets being eaten by birds. But Joseph has a little bad news. He tells him that in 3 days, he will be executed and eaten by birds. Man. And so that brings us to the fulfillment of the dreams, verses 20 through 22. So Pharaoh, he throws a birthday, and both dreams come to pass. The cupbearer is restored, and check this out, the baker is hanged. And then that brings us, go up to verse 23, where you'll see the ingratitude of the cupbearer. Despite Joseph's plea, the cupbearer forgets about him once he's restored to his position. See, that's just like people, make those little empty promises, and then, out of sight, out of mind. So this chapter continues Joseph's journey in Egypt, where he encounters 2 of Pharaoh's disgraced officers in prison. Known for his God-given ability to interpret dreams, Joseph provides clarity for the troubled men, shedding light on their fates, but finds himself forgotten despite his aid. Right? And so you'll find some themes in this chapter 40. See if you can find those themes running through the chapter. That's dream interpretation, God's gifts and abilities, ingratitude. See if you can see divine timing, deliverance, and justice. And then what are the topics? You have dreams and their meanings, restoration and punishment, forgotten promises, divine intervention, ancient Egyptian hierarchy. And who are the people in chapter 40? Joseph, Pharaoh, the chief cupbearer, the chief baker, and our locations, as stated previously, were Egypt, Pharaoh's palace, and the captain's prison. And so we have this verse from Proverbs 30:8 through 9. So we see where it ties in. Remove far from me falsehood and lying. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God. And so we see here, when we think about deception, man, we've seen it from the time we've started in Genesis 3 and 4 with the serpent lying to Eve. And then we see Abraham, in Genesis 12, saying that Sarah is his sister. And then Genesis 20, saying it again, that she's his sister. And then Genesis 26, when the men ask him, is she your wife? And again, another lie that's told. And then we see in Jacob and Rebecca lying there. We see Jacob impersonating Esau, lying there, lying in deception. So we just see this theme. We see Jacob's sons lying to the Shechemites. Right, and then we come up to Genesis 37, where we see Reuben. He's thrown in Joseph is thrown in the pit, and Reuben, he's deceiving a little bit because he's acting like he's going along with the brothers, but then the whole time he's planning to return Joseph. So we see this theme of deception. I mean, it's a little weary, but it makes us feel a little bit better that, hey, maybe things have always been bad since the beginning of time, since sin entered the world. And so that wraps up our preview. I hope you're ready. Come on, let's jump into chapter 40 and then chapter 38. Don't forget your strategies if that's what you're going to dive into this weekend, and then we'll pick back up following next week. All right, y'all, be blessed.